hopefully you're all seeing what I'm seeing, which is the pictures through my talk. And as long as that works out, yes, of course, I'm starting just with a quick tribute to my dad, because it's so appropriate to be doing this. I mean, he taught me so much about Worcester porcelain of all kinds, and so especially the early period, down with the subject of the talk today. I'm not intending to go much beyond the 1750s, but Worcester carried on a great deal. And when I was such a young boy, Dad took me onto the factory. He let me play in the museum, running around the cases when I was 9, 10 years old. And that was the place to learn all about Worcester porcelain. So thank you, Dad, for giving me the love and the joy of fine china, which Worcester is all about. And that's what we're covering today, because this picture is when you were, I think there's some sort of artificial digitary here. You're not really standing in the mud down by Warmstry House, but that's where you spent so much time digging up the fragments of Worcester porcelain made here at the Worcester factory site beside the river, starting there in 1751, 1752, production starting. And that's really where our story about the shops begins, because here in the early illustration from the Gentleman's Magazine of 1752, it tells us that the first sale of the manufactory Worcester Music Meeting on September the 20th. That's 1752, where a great variety of ware is going to be for sale, and 'tis said at a moderate price. And so humble beginnings in Worcester at the Worcester Music Meeting. The owners of the factory, the partners, Dr. Wall and his colleagues, realized that in order to succeed, Worcester wasn't going to be the marketplace. They had to go to London. And this is really where it all starts. And a very small part of London, they opened a warehouse at a rather grand location, a grand building called London House. London House, Aldersgate Street. It originally had been the home of the Bishop of London in the 17th century. And by 1750-51, it was operating as a maternity hospital. But that closed in 1751. It moved across the road, and the building became warehousing, and it was up for hire. You could use space in the grand London House. And Worcester moved in there somewhere around about 1753, we think, maybe certainly by 1754. They were advertising first auction sales. To begin with, they felt the best way to market their china was to sell it in auctions to the trade only. It was the usual way. Chelsea and the other factories did the same. And Worcester's China warehouse was where it was all on display to the trade. And in March 1754 was the first of their great auctions by candle. It was done in those days. Their first auction was a mere 40,000 pieces. What a collection that would be. That was the beginning of 1754. The following year, they had an even bigger sale, or they planned to in August 1755, but they delayed it for a couple of months. They couldn't get so much china available to be lotted and sold all in time, and they put it on sale, therefore, later in 1755 by the candle to the trade. But I think they felt auctions were a little bit uncertain. The China dealers of London were a fairly, well, let's say, they wanted to buy the Worcester china as cheap as possible, and Worcester felt we better go a little bit more public, and they invited, therefore, the general trade as well as public to come along to their shop, really now, the China warehouse in Aldersgate Street, where you could buy wholesale and retail the great Worcester porcelain sent there for sale. And we know so much about all this because there in the warehouse, a price list was produced, and we have the one of the great treasures of the museum. It's not a piece of porcelain; it's a piece of scruffy paper. But this was the only surviving original price list and trade card of the early Worcester factory, and it lists all the items that were available in the warehouse, and it dates from around 1755. The items are described in a brief listing, which is printed, and then handwritten prices alongside. And because it was a wholesale warehouse, they're priced per dozen. So this is bulk selling of the Worcester porcelain. Some things are also priced individually and each, and it's a little confusing just what these prices mean, but I'll refer to them. They're very useful to give an indication of the proportions of one thing to another. So I'm going to go through all this item. Imagine you're going into the Worcester China warehouse, and you got your price list, and you're going to go shelf by shelf and see what the factory is selling. And each items are described in a very simple terms. And along with prices, it begins with cups and saucers and basins, which are bowls, and they're listed according to size and different prices for the different sizes. So let's start at the top of the list. It starts with cups and saucers and quarter pint basins and coffees. So these are the cups and saucers. And in those days, a cup and saucer, a cup wasn't a coffee cup with a handle, it was a tea bowl. These are the cups and saucers. And apart from very few, like one here that has got a little handle on the side, the cups and saucers were tea bowls for drinking tea in the Chinese manner. So no handle, just a handleless cup, and you would place them on the saucer and drink your tea rather carefully in the Chinese way. And the decoration very much in the Chinese taste. So these are all the sort of pieces that would have been on sale there at this particular time. And the basins is the name for a bowl. And it's interesting to note that bowls weren't sold according to the size. You'd think we would be mentioning a 6-inch bowl or a 9-inch bowl, but it was all done by the capacity, the amount of liquor that they held. So the bowls are available as quarter pint basins at 3 and 6pence, or half pint basins were 6 shillings, and pint ditto at 9 shillings, and quart basins were 15 shillings. So different sizes, and those prices would have been per dozen. At least per dozen for the blue and white. We believe the list probably referring just to the cheaper blue and white wares, and you had to negotiate different prices for the more costly enamelled porcelain. But this here is a larger one. This is one of the quart basins. And the factory didn't mind what you used it for. You could use it for tea, you could use it for punch, or for cream, whatever you wanted to put in your basin. It didn't really matter. But we would think one as big as this, we would call it a punch bowl, and it would have had strong liquor inside. More confusing is the other item listed on this first entry. It mentions the basins and King's coffees, which sold for 3 and 6pence. So King's coffees, and one is therefore thinking of the illustration of the time. This is a view of the of Tom King's coffee house. Tom and the Kings were notorious owners of a coffee shop in Covent Garden. A coffee house was, and on the table inside there, a riotous evening is being spent, and they have cups and saucers and bowls. These are the basins that Worcester's been selling, or similar porcelain on there. But it wasn't just coffee that you had at King's Coffee House. Most of the customers there riotously drunk and broke most of the china and were forced to pay for it, even if they hadn't. And as well as coffee, there was plenty of other things available on sale there, for which Covent Garden was rather notorious at the time. Hogarth did the illustration. So that's King's Coffee House. And I'm wondering, I don't think that's quite what was meant by Worcester's list here, even though Aldersgate was just round the corner from this. So King's Coffees, I've racked my brain trying to think what they actually are. And I'm assuming that they're these, just some large cups, bigger than the normal coffee cup. They're photographed here alongside a standard size cup. You get some bigger ones. They were only made for a short time in the middle 1750s, and they come in various decorations, usually enameled with Chinese figures. So these are the big coffee cups, and I think they're the King's coffees that are being referred to. No doubt about what is mentioned next, because we have here teapots, and that was Worcester's speciality, and understandably. And teapots were available, again, according to the size. Round teapots came in first, second, and third sizes, and they were priced accordingly at 15 shillings, 21 shillings, or 27 shillings per dozen for those teapots. And they were also available as fluted, panelled, and octagonal. So let's look at some of those. The teapots don't need much introduction. They are the perfect shape, and Worcester really did invent the absolute perfection in teapots, because if you pick them up, they invite you to pour from them, and they pour without a drip, and the cover doesn't fall off. They're balanced to perfection. And also, they are designed so they don't crack and break. With hot boiling water inside, they don't crack open in front of you. So you can use Worcester teapots, and there was a huge rush of people going in to get their fine Worcester teapots, which we all have here. So these are the round ones. And you also have the other versions. These are fluted teapots. And so the broad flute shape came in around about 1754, and was a popular alternative to the plain. Really, it was a nicely balanced form. You get more complicated moulded flutes on the example on the bottom right, which is slightly earlier. And on the left, top left there, you can see one of the octagonal teapots. The description perfectly sums up this form, which is 8-sided, slightly unusual, slightly awkward shape because the lids never fit. They didn't fire them terribly easily. They were difficult to make, and therefore great rarities today. And these cost more than the plain ones at 30 shillings per dozen. And the other shape, these are the panelled ones. They have a panel moulded on the side. So these have one panel on each side, and in the panels are painted with little design in blue and white. Again, beautiful shapes, and the design of the pattern also is perfection, because Worcester knew where to stop. They wanted the moulding, which is extremely delicate, to speak for itself. And so they didn't put an outline of frame in blue. They didn't use the blue to pick out the flowers in the moulding. The delicate flutes and the delicate Rococo scrollwork is all left just white. So there's a lightness and a refreshing feel to the design and the decoration, and the shape. They pour beautifully. You can't get a better teapot than one of these. And 30 shillings a dozen. You could have what a bargain. Down the list to cover all the items for sale, next to the teapots and the cups are milk jugs. And it's interesting to see this distinction between the terms that they use to describe how these things were used. Here we have milk jugs, round and pressed, at 8 shillings or 12 shillings. The round ones are fairly obvious. Here they are, small jugs. We often they get described today as cream jugs, but that's not the case. They weren't for cream, they were only for milk, and this was to put milk in your tea to soften the harsh black tea that was available at the time. And you poured a little bit of milk to your own taste into your tea. We have become used to calling these sparrowbeak jugs nowadays because of the shape of the little lip, but that wasn't a contemporary term. These were round milk jugs, and beautiful things they are too, especially when they have the lovely little turned feet, which examples from the mid-1750s tend to have. Beautiful little shapes, so delicate. These are some of the pressed ones. Pressed being they are made in a two-piece mould, one mould for each side, and pressed together, and you push the clay to pick out the moulding. And so these are oval in section and moulded on each side, either with the feather moulding, the peacock feather design on 2 of these, or fluting. They're shapes that match the teapots. It's interesting to note that they are specifically designed to be the same forms as the teapots. They're part of the same set. They're used in conjunction. So these are milk jugs pressed, and all of the same date. Occasionally found in blue and white, also found in wonderful enamel decorations. Love the jug on the bottom right with the little Chinese figure walking past a fence. Gorgeous. And instead of milk, if you want to serve cream, you can't put it in one of your milk jugs. You have to have the right receptacle for cream, and that was a cream ewer. And a cream ewer is, well, nowadays we call them cream boats, but you'll soon get an idea of what they look like when you look for the description ribbed and panelled. Cream ewers, ribbed and panelled. And here are the ribbed ones. Ribs or fluted ribs. These are ribbed cream ewers, and they were for pouring cream, not on into your tea or coffee, but for pouring cream over your strawberries, over your fruit. Fruit was special and costly, and you used a cream ewer to pour sweetened cream. It was cream mixed with sugar, and you would pour that gently at great expense onto your fruit with a beautiful Worcester cream ewer. And these cost a little bit less than the moulded milk jugs of the same time. Or instead of the ribbed ones, you can get the panelled ones, which are these. And so these, we tend to often use the term for of hexagonal when we talk about these today, but it wasn't mentioned. Some of them are oval, some of them are hexagonal in section, but the significance is they always have a panel moulded on the side. And that panel, once again, like on the teapots, is left as light as anything, just with the decoration painted in the window. So you're looking through the icy frosty frame of the window at the delicate Chinese scene outside. And lovingly done in blue and white. A rare example on the bottom left is using transfer printing, a new technology. Some of the pieces on sale in 1755 and 56 at the warehouse would have been decorated with the new technology, Worcester's great invention of transfer printing. And we finally come on to the coffee cups, listed quite separately to the cups and saucers. And this is very significant in its own way, because coffee cups were really quite a different drink. They were a quite different purpose and used in a different way to the tea bowls and saucers we'd seen before. Coffee cups and cans are listed at 5 shillings a dozen. And if you paid a little bit more, you could have a ribbed one or a waved one. So let's look at these. Obvious, really, these are coffee cups and the classic shape of early Worcester cups. Gradually, during the 1750s, the shape of most Worcester cups changed from a wider base to a narrower, smaller base. So they became more U-shaped, less flat in section at the bottom. The handles changed very little in form during the 1750s and 60s. It's usually the same, very neatly folded over molded handle, which has a groove running down the side of it. Very delicate, so much nicer than a great improvement, especially on the shape of Chinese coffee cups of the time. These imitate and pretend to be Chinese, but they are thinner and better made than the Chinese porcelain ones and have this much nicer handle, a joy to drink out of. You could have the cans, and the cans, I suppose if you're going to be serving these in a riotous coffee house, it's probably just as well that they're more stable. The coffee cans are more stable on the bottom than they are flat-bottomed cans rather than the cups. They were just an alternative. And contemporary illustrations show people in coffee houses passing around a tray or a salver of silver on which a little set of 6 cups is placed. They were handed around and taken from the silver tray, and you would drink your coffee and put it down when you'd finished. And so coffee cups served, and they didn't have saucers, and they were just individual cups for drinking your coffee. And the shape of Worcester coffee cans is lovely. A little spreading base inspired by contemporary silver. It has, again, such an elegance to it, so much nicer than if they'd been dead straight, they wouldn't be nearly as much fun. But slightly more expensive, a little bit smaller in capacity, you get the molded coffee cups. And these are the coffee cups and cans, ribbed and waved. Ribbed are the ones with the fine flutes, either straight down flutes or the strap fluting a little bit wider. 2 different types of fluting occur on these early cups. And the waved versions is, it's fairly obvious, but it's nice to know the contemporary name for the waves. But when you see the whole design on a coffee pot, you realize they're not actually waves at all, but they are feathers. It is the shape of a peacock feather on the cup on the left. And so we call them nowadays feather molded. But because they only had part of the feather on the cup, they decided to refer to them as waved, which makes a lot of sense. Various different molded handles were used on these early molded cups, and they cost a bit more to have your coffee in one of these. I guess a little bit more elaborate, different shapes, leaving the sets and moving on to other shapes for your home. And we list decanters and mugs. And it's, I must admit, for years I was totally mistaken in looking at this list. I assumed, like I'm sure most of you will do, seeing the word decanter, that it must be something like this. The water bottles that were made, we call them gugglets today, or water bottles. And these are usually slightly earlier in date than most of the items we've been looking at on this list. And also, they don't come in different sizes, but the decanters were listed in very different sizes. We're looking for items that are quart and 3 pint and single pint sizes. So this doesn't add up. They can't be these bottles. So what are they instead? And I realized what it was when I was looking through a book of early pottery. This is a trade card slightly earlier in date from Nottingham, from the Nottingham salt glazed stoneware manufacturer of James Morley. And he had a trade card of some of his items for sale, and illustrates there a cappuccine, which is a coffee cup, and a teapot, and a mog, which is a nice way of spelling mug. And on the top left, there is a decanter. And it's very obviously not the glass bottles we think of today. Instead, it is the shape of a jug, shown here in the salt glazed versions from James Morley. And this was how the name was used. A decanter was a vessel for transferring liquor from a barrel to the glass or to a bottle or a mug. So you would fill your decanter from the cask in the cellar of wine or beer, and then you would serve it at your table in a Worcester decanter. We tend to call these cider jugs or ale jugs today, but in 1755 in the shop, you had to ask for a decanter, and this is what you would have got. And they came in smaller versions of 1 pint up to large examples of a quart, or even 3 pints. A quart is 2 pints. A 3-pint jug are the nice big ones, and some of these can be very splendid in size, indeed. And they are beautifully decorated. If you are lucky enough to own any of these, they're wonderful bits of porcelain. They're usually misshapen, they're distorted, they're never very straight, so they wobble quite badly. Worcester weren't very good at making them, but they were wonderful at decorating them, especially when they look like these. So Worcester decanters, but we'll probably go on calling them jugs, or if you're watching from America, you'll call them pitchers. But they should be called decanters. No doubt about the mugs, half pint, pint and quart size. So they came according to the capacity. And there were 2 general shapes, straight-sided cylinder mugs or bell-shaped. It's not really the shape of a bell, but that's what everyone has got used to calling these oval mugs. And they have the same shape handle on most examples, a moulded handle with ribs running down it. And so here, just 6 of, you can get many different examples, all in the same patterns. So we're looking at this talk according to the shapes, and the patterns were varied, and some were very popular. These are all examples in the popular beckoning Chinaman pattern, as it's become known, with a Chinese figure waving there. And but the price list probably refers to the blue and white examples. Here, one of the cylinder ones, a slightly flared base, and the splendid strap handles that they can sometimes have. The strap bending around at the bottom, very like silver, very delicate, sometimes a bit too thin for the weight of the mug when it's full. But lovely things to admire and to hold, and to realize how wonderful luck that they have survived at all. Because those of you who listened to my talk previously on mugs here, I talked about the fact that they were used for drinking hot liquor. You warmed the cider and beer in the Worcester mug by plunging a red hot poker inside them, and heated them beside the fireplace. So Worcester's soap rock porcelain was immune to breaking when it went by the fire. Wonderful stuff. And so we can enjoy these today. Moving down the list, wash hand basins and chamber pots. Well, very clear what they refer to. And here the price doesn't work out per dozen. So we have to assume that some of these are listing individually. So I'm sure they're not 3 and 6pence a dozen. In proportion to others on the list, these are 3 and 6pence each, was the price of a wash hand basin. And they're jolly rare things, not often found as early as this date. The example on the bottom right, we have a splendid example of this in the museum. Sorry, it's only a black and white picture I put there, but that one dated 1754. So it's right for the date of our visit to the shop. And the other ones, probably 1756, would be about right. So very wonderful decoration. and these basins would have had matching bottles to go with them. But the bottles aren't listed here. The list only mentions the basins. Chamber pots. I've got a blank screen, I'm afraid, because here I can't show you a chamber pot from this date. It's the only thing on the list. I can't, because they've all got used. People used their chamber pots, and inevitably they broke. And so, but they were utility objects. They weren't meant to be treasured in a cabinet. They were used under the bed, and they got broken. So all the Worcester chamber pots from this date have got broken. I'd love to find one, but to my knowledge, none has survived. But they were there on sale at 4 shillings each. But I'd love to find one. You do get early Worcester chamber pots, but not quite this date. You get these. This one is from about 1770. And there are few know that these in the museum from 1768, 1770. And a handful of this date are known, but no earlier chamber pots. We know they made lots of them, but very few survived because they were used. And a lot of these things are quite rare today, but it's nice to see them on the list. You don't often find tureens at this early date, but they were making them, and they came in 2 different shapes, round and oval. And the tureens were available in both sizes, both shapes were made in 2 sizes. And these will be also, I think, priced each at 7 and 6pence and 12 and 6pence. The price of each one is mentioned specifically each this time. These are round tureens. The round tureen, sorry, I couldn't find a colour picture when I needed it, but there's one of the examples in blue and white of a Worcester tureen from about 1754, and with a twig as a handle and funny masks on the side handles. And those are the round tureens. They're thick and heavy, not things Worcester was successful at making. And no wonder they are rare today. The lid hardly fitting at all. Later in the 1750s, by about 1756, 57, they introduced a new shape of round bowl and cover. We tend to think of them as broth bowls or as equels, soup bowls, but they are in effect tureens. And these also would have suited the description of the round tureens of the first size, the smaller ones, on sale around that time. Oval tureens, first and second size, they get more expensive, much bigger, and therefore much more expensive than the round tureens. The oval tureens are fantastic objects, huge. There's one of these in the museum, and boy, the lid is a disgrace. The lid is so heavily misshapen and warped and distorted, it barely goes on at all. It only goes on one way, and it rocks and wobbles. It really is. It's a pretty disgraceful example of potting, but it's the best that Worcester could do with these big pots. Their porcelain recipe was fine for making very delicate little tea bowls, but when it got too big, it distorted, and the Chinese ones were an awful lot better, and therefore people bought them probably next door in the Chinese warehouse rather than buying them at Worcester's shop. So not many of these survive today, but they were there on sale in London. Below those, smaller objects here, and these were successfully made because we know exactly what these are: tart pans and potting pans. And each were made in 3 different sizes: first size, second, and third sizes, proportionally priced, 4 shillings, 6 shillings, or 8 shillings. And I think we're back to a dozen each for those prices again. And potting pans a bit more expensive. So you can learn from that the difference. Tart pans are the smaller, cheaper ones, and that's here we've got the tart pans. Here are the small round bowls, which were used for pâté, little potted meats of some sort. or some other forms of tart were fired and cooked in these little pans and served on your table. And little sets of these were available there. Potting pans, in comparison, are deeper. So a tart pan is the shallow patty pan. The deeper potting pan is for potted meat, for potting shrimps and potting fish. You would cook your potted delicacies within the Worcester pots, and they were available to be heated because Worcester porcelain was so strong. You could bake in your oven your potted concoctions and serve them at your table in Worcester potting pans, which we see here. Then we have the coming on to a very distinctive shape of boats. And it's funny seeing boats being on sale, nothing to do with the boats other than they're loosely boat-shaped, but they are, of course, what we know as sauce boats. And various different sauce boats are listed now on the list. Start with the two-handled boats, available in different versions, three different sizes. And here they are, the two-handled boats in the first, second, and third sizes. The big ones, the third size, have little animals' heads moulded on the handles, and they're quite splendid big pieces of potting. Some are available in much smaller versions, and these sold quite expensively, but you did get a dozen each for these prices. The other boats are single-handled examples, and they were either made in panelled or fluted versions. And you can start getting an idea of the use of the terminology on this list now. Panelled means what it says. These are the panelled examples. They have the moulded panels on the side, and looking through the little windows of the panels, and there is the decoration in the little Chinese scenes. So these are panelled boats made in a nominal two sizes, because there's many different versions of these. And the fluted ones are, again, as you see here, two different sizes, more expensive than the panelled ones, because I suppose they're a little bit bigger. And the finely fluted examples, some have moulded panels as well as the flutes that you can see there. And alternative, quite clearly described, sauce boats, high-footed in first, second, and third size. Well, you can picture those in your mind, I'm sure, before I even show them on the screen. But here they are, the high-footed sauce boats, the classic shape of Worcester in the 1753, 4, 5. They made so many of these sauce boats. It didn't matter that they were a little bit wobbly and misshapen. They could still sell them because the shape gets away with it. You don't notice that they're not actually terribly even, but the decoration sets them off anyway. So high-footed sauce boats on different sizes, the larger third size ones costing up to 27 shillings a dozen, and wonderful objects they are too. Very different description, but again, very descriptive, so we know exactly what we're looking at here. There we've got the partridges, white on the first size, second size. Partridges either white or ditto enamelled. So what's a partridge? Well, of course, it's one of these. And the fact that they're listing them specifically as available in white is important, because there's not many white ones known. I've found very few in existence, but they were sold this way. They're not unfinished. They're on the list. You could buy them partridges in white in the first or second size. But for more money, you would have the enamelled ones. And there's the partridge tureens. There's a lovely one of these in the museum. And here is a pair. They came as pairs, left and right. But in the price list, you had to price them up and buy them separately. But they came as matching pairs. And the enamel versions, the first has the lid lifts off just to the bird, top of the bird only. The larger ones, the second size, you lift up the top of the nest as well, and it has the bigger decoration around the nest. These large ones are particularly rare today, and great pieces of early Worcester. Cornucopias also came in two different sizes, and here I'm sure they're listed. These aren't per dozen; these must be listed each because of the proportions of what they would have cost. 2 and 3 would be the price of these cornucopias, and aren't they splendid things? You have to have a pair, left and a right, always. Many have got separated. The smaller ones are shown here in the coloured enamelled versions. These larger second size ones are not that much bigger, but they cost an extra 3 each. For the bigger cornucopia, these ones decorated in blue and white, and classic examples made to hang on the wall to fill with flowers from your garden, looking very splendid in their Worcester porcelain cornucopias. And here it says exactly what it is on the tin. There you are, potting pots and covers, white oval basket work. So the whole thing is described. They were only sold there in the white, and for 2 and 6 you could buy one of these, a potting pot and cover just in the white with oval basket work. Funny things, why they would make them only white. There's a few known, like the one in the picture here, that have some slightly later colouring added to them. I think they're left hanging around at the warehouse or left in the factory because nobody bought them. They were usually very poorly potted and misshapen. I can't have seen a ready market for these in the white. They look very dull. And so nobody bought the white ones, and they painted a few later on in yellow. So enormously rare today, but unpopular at the time. But there they are on the list, perfectly described with oval basket work. Dishes, scallop shells. We know what those are. First, second, third, and fourth sizes. So scallop shells made in many different sizes and proportionately priced. And here they are. Of course, lovely things to collect. We call them pickle dishes today. The bigger ones, we call them sweetmeat dishes. But you could have used them for whatever you wanted. They're not specified as pickle or sweetmeat or anything else. You could put whatever you wanted into a scallop shell, but they were for serving on the table to improve the taste of your food. You had strong pickles and sweet delicacies alongside in a Worcester scallop shell in many different sizes. The bigger ones usually wonderfully painted, the smaller ones often a bit blurred. And other shapes of these little dishes, and a little bit more confusing. I'm not sure quite that Worcester understood the difference between one leaf and another. They describe vine leaves and fig leaves, and they're available at 2 sizes, and the smaller size much cheaper than the bigger ones. So let's have a look at these. But I mean, what is the difference between a vine leaf and a fig leaf? In antiquity, we tend to say that you hide your modesty on your statues with a fig leaf, but usually they were covered up with vine leaves. But they seem to have been you could use whichever you wanted. They were interchangeable if you were an ancient Roman. So what do you do when you're in Worcester's warehouse? Well, here we have vine leaves, I think. A vine leaf with a serrated edge. These are the 2 shapes of vine leaf. The smaller one is a bit bigger than most pickle dishes today. And so that would be the 4-shilling example. And the 8 shillings example, twice as much, you got the big ones, which were dessert dishes of some kind. So the bigger vine leaves and the smaller vine leaves here. Alternatively, fig leaves. Well, I mean, these must be figs. these are the bigger fig leaves at 12 shillings. So, and they're exactly the shape of a popular image of a fig leaf there. So these decorated usually in enamel, rare to find in blue and white, and very rare in the Truncer printed example. But these are more tricky. Somewhere we need to find fig leaves at 4 shillings, so a third the price of these other leaves. So they must be small, and I think they must be these ones. These are, we tend to say today, but they're ivy leaves. Shows the difficulty. I'm going to asking mechanically minded friends what's the difference, and can you get fig leaves this shape? And it says, oh yes, they can be any shape you like. It just depends when you pick them. So early picked fig leaves, but we will probably still call them ivy leaves today. But they're a pickle, and Worcester made an awful lot of them. They made lots of these as well, Dutch jugs. And Dutch jugs, odd word, presumably named because they were aimed at the Dutch market. They sold particularly well in Holland, which was a big export trade for the Worcester factory and the London merchants. And so they were made Dutch jugs in 2 different sizes at a range of prices from 3 and 6pence up to 8 shillings per dozen, or each, whichever. These are Dutch jugs, and we know the shape well. They have cabbage leaves moulded around the body, and sometimes they have a mask face on the top. The early ones usually, though, have no mask lip. You just pour them from the rounded top instead. And you could use them for pouring as a jug or for drinking as a mug. So they have 2 purposes. So if you felt particularly thirsty and want to drink a big gulps of cider and beer, you'd hold one of these jugs and drink from them, but you could also pour from your Dutch jug. And Worcester made lots of these, or they tried to. They weren't always as successful as they intended. You can get some pretty wonky ones. These are some. If you weren't drunk to begin with, when you start drinking out of the Worcester mugs, just looking at them would start to make you queasy. And but these are the second quality or third quality of Worcester Dutch jugs. And finally, going down the list, leaf sauce boats enamelled. Well, a very clear description. The leaf sauce boats were being sold at 3 and 6pence a dozen, and they sold in large numbers for a short space of time. They were being made in 1755, about 1754 to 1755, just into 1756. And during that time, lots and lots of these wonderful sauce boats were made. Shown here with some fragments which Dad dug up on the low levels of the Worcester factory. So we know that they were being made just for a short time in the mid-1750s. And here are some examples of these, but they were only listed as enamelled, and you don't get blue and white ones, only a couple are known. So enamelled only at 3 and 6pence. So we've gone through the list, many other various sorts, cheap in proportion. So not everything is on the list, but there were other options available. And it makes one think there are some surprising gaps in this list, where, for instance, are coffee pots. They were a staple product of the factory. It's surprising that it mentions all those pots, but no coffee pots are mentioned. But and there must be under these other sorts in proportion. So you could have had mustard pots, and dry mustard or wet mustard pots. They were making finger bowls and stands. They're not listed on the list. It might be that some of these shapes were only introduced in the end of 1756, and the list had to be updated. So our list ends at a certain point in time, and some of these shapes maybe were just coming in later. It's interesting to think. There's no sucriers, sugar bowls are not listed there. You've got the jugs for milk and the teapots. When you think about it, most Worcester sugar bowls like the one here date from 1756, 57, 58. You don't get them as quite earlier. So slightly earlier ones you don't see very often. Um, uh, so also these cabbage leaf dishes, popular shape today, but most examples we get are from the later 1750s maybe. So these are shapes that are just coming in a little bit later and weren't on the list. Cutlery handles, butter boats, other little shapes here, that rather strange butter cooler. So there are other shapes, but it's interesting to see what's not on the list. And particularly strange, as they're shown on the top of the list on the title, in the engraving and the wonderful trade cards on the list, it shows little plates in the windows. But plates aren't listed. Imagine a china shop and you couldn't buy plates. It seems unheard of, but that was the problem that Worcester had. These plates are like the ones that were perhaps in the illustration, and these were made at Worcester in 1752, 3. But by 1754, they'd stopped making them. They just couldn't do it. They were thick and they were clumsy and they were misshapen, and they weren't nearly as good as the Chinese ones. You could go to the Chinese warehouses in London and buy sets of Chinese plates like these from a Nanking cargo, beautifully thin and readily available from China. And Worcester couldn't make them as well and couldn't make them as cheap. And therefore, they weren't making plates at this date. So instead, in the warehouse, Worcester didn't start making plates again until about 1757 and 58, and generally not till the 1760s. So it's that period they weren't selling plates. So just in the title page at the top, it shows some vases. And no vases are listed for sale, but they might be under the miscellaneous listing because there were vases available at this date. They're not common, but they're lovely. The illustration in the title page at the top shows one of these wasted vases, in just like the blue and white one I've put alongside. And the vase below with the bird and snail is known dated 1754. The little tiny vases in the Chinese manner there, shown on the other side of the illustration. And these little vases would have been also trinkets for sale in the warehouse. And so I wanted to go and visit the site of London House and to see where these things were being sold. But it's not there anymore. And searching for London House, as it was in Aldersgate Street, I discovered a plaque on. It's now the site is now offices and apartments in this block, and on the wall there's a plaque that says it's the site of London House that was destroyed by fire in 1766. So that tells us what happens to Worcester's London warehouse. It was burnt down 10 years after the price list we've been looking at. And it's perhaps sad to think of what's at the end of Worcester's warehouse and how its site is now marked by this plaque, which was made by Dalton. It really is a bit ironic. There's a Dalton plaque that commemorates London House, where Worcester had its showrooms. But the Worcester showroom moved. They announced in 1767 that a new warehouse was opened in Gough Square in Fleet Street, and the manager there, John Sandon, announced that he'd moved a large quantity of the goods from the late warehouse in Aldersgate Street and moved it to the new warehouse in Gough Square. And they sold again by auction. Having successfully run their warehouse for a while, Worcester knew that London was a very important marketplace. They're gearing their products all the way for London. The London dealers now were sending down London porcelain, Chelsea and Bow to Worcester. Worcester copied it, as examples shown here, and it was then sent back to London for sale. London remained the place where all the selling was being done. And Worcester being rather far away from London, unless you have your eye on the ball of what's being sold in the shops of London, you're not going to succeed as a factory. So Worcester had its eyes out to London and formed an arrangement then with James Giles. The Worcester porcelain was sent now in the white to London. It was decorated in the latest London taste, and both the Worcester factory managers and James Giles were selling their wares in auctions and exhibited in for sale in London right through the 18th century. And so carrying on that story is, again, one for another time, but it's worth thinking of where they ended up. The Aldersgate Street store is now marked by a Dalton plaque. The other Worcester shops, Giles and Worcester, were selling their wares in Spring Gardens at the bottom corner of Trafalgar Square, where there's now a hotel on the site. If you want to find Flight's London shop at Coventry Street, it's now underneath a Kentucky Fried Chicken shop. Was there now, and Chamberlain's shop has been replaced in Bond Street. 155 New Bond Street would have been underneath the Time Life building. So there's now a wonderful Henry Moore carving on top of Worcester's Chamberlain's London warehouse and shop, and it now sells Hermes ashtrays, which is not really the same thing as Worcester porcelain at all. But in thinking of what's there today, we're going back and remember what it must have been like to go shopping back in the 18th century for all that wonderful porcelain. And if only you could buy the things I've been showing you for as little as 8 shillings a dozen, that would be nice. Thank you.